Hello YouTube, thank you for your questions. I will take them in alphabetical order, although starting with the people whose names are written with non-English characters, and I can't pronounce any of these. So we will begin with somebody who has a name in what appear to be Asian symbols. This person asks, number one, do you think there is an idol worship problem in philosophy? No, not particularly. Not more so than in any other disciplines. Actually, I think in philosophy it's probably less so than in any other disciplines, because we do like criticising each other. We do like poking holes in the positions and arguments that other philosophers have given. I mean, even when we have philosophical heroes, one of the things we like to do to our philosophical heroes is show why they are wrong. So I think philosophers are pretty good at questioning authority. Again, relative to other people, other disciplines, I don't see much of an idol worship problem. Maybe there's a bandwagoning problem. Like there is, I think, a tendency sometimes for philosophers to kind of all converge on a single view without it really being supported by compelling argument. Physicalism, for instance, I don't think is really supported by arguments that are compelling enough to justify the degree of convergence that that particular metaphysical position has seen. But even in that case, you know, like there's a whole load of debate about what exactly counts as physicalism, and there isn't really like an authority on physicalism. You know, and even if there were an authority on it, I think we would probably spend our time trying to explain why they're wrong. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's something like a bandwagoning problem. I don't really see an idol worship problem. I don't see that. Number two, what are your thoughts on sane, consensual slavery, specifically in regard to those in the BDSM community who practice 24/7 total power exchange relationships? Well, first of all, that's, of course, not really slavery, right? These people will live as if they were slaves, but of course they can actually leave whenever they want. They continue doing it because they choose to do so, because they want to do so. So, yeah, you know, this is just an aspect of consensual non-consent, which of course is not really non-consent. It's a pretense. And obviously it's fine for people to engage in whatever pretenses they like. It's fine for consenting adults to do whatever they want with each other. I don't have any objections to that at all. Further question, though, is can people sell themselves into genuine slavery? Is that something that you should be able to do? Can you know, sign a contract which would then obligate you to become an actual slave so that somebody really does just own you as property? Well, no, not in my view. I don't think anybody is ever obligated to do anything in particular. I don't think anybody is ever obligated to perform any specific action for anybody else. So you know, even if you sign a contract signing yourself into slavery, you can walk away whenever you want. And maybe we would, I don't know, we might impose some sort of cost on you for doing that, but you know, for violating that contract. But no, the idea that somebody should be forced into genuine slavery, even if it's something that they have, you know, chosen to do, or like chosen to do at some point in the past, even though they're not choosing to do it now, I wouldn't accept that. Yeah, so, but when it comes to, as you put it, sane, consensual slavery, I mean, that's not really even slavery, that's just people playing a game, and people can play whatever games they want. Actually, another point here, you say sane, consensual slavery. I don't think you need the word sane there. I think that this is probably a hint to safe, sane, and consensual. I prefer the RAC model, risk-aware consensual kink. And one of the reasons for this, I mean, there's several reasons for this, but number one, I think that the sanity condition in safe, sane, and consensual is just very vague. And if we make it more precise, it's going to be either too conservative, too restrictive, or it's just going to be redundant, right? So you know, I mean, the way I put it is, look, if something is safe and consensual, then what more could you possibly want, right? What more work are we doing by saying that it also has to be sane, right? So what's an example of something that is safe and consensual, but that is not sane? You know, so like I think what's going to happen there is this is just imposing conservative restrictions on the interactions of consenting adults, and I mean, actually, as would be suggested by endorsing something like risk-aware consensual kink, I don't think even safety is required. It's up to each individual to decide what kinds of risks they want to take, but certainly sanity, whatever that is supposed to mean, is not required. So I'm perfectly happy with insane consensual slavery as well. Again, where this is a pretense. Okay, then moving on to somebody who appears to have a Greek name. I'm not really sure. Maybe Russian. I don't know. Number one, what are your favourite arguments against philosophical idealism? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of this depends on the kind of idealism in question and the kind of arguments that the idealists are using in favour of their position. I would say, you know, one of the key moves that idealists tend to make that I would want to resist. So a lot of idealists tend to see their position as in some way resisting skepticism, right? Because under idealism, there's not going to be any kind of veil of perception or anything like that, right? It's not a case of, okay, we directly perceive sense data and then we make an inference that material objects cause sense data. You know, there's just the mind. Okay, there's just the mental stuff that we don't even need the postulation of material objects beyond that. I think that in order to get to idealism, there is just as much of an inference or a leap of faith, or however you might want to call it, as there is to get to the postulation of material objects. So when I look at a tree, let's say, what is actually phenomenally present is a tree. It's not like I look at a tree and then the phenomenal experience is that of the concept of a tree, or the representation of a tree, or the mental image of a tree. No, I look at a tree and I just have the experience of a tree. And there may be there's no phenomena of mentality, right? There may not be any experience, as I say, of like a representation of a tree or a self looking at a tree or anything like that. Now, you might say that what I'm like really seeing, what I'm really perceiving, is just a concept or representation or mental image of a tree, right, rather than the tree itself. But the key point is that requires an inference, right, just as much as does the claim that I'm looking at a material object. So yeah, I mean, in taking the immediate phenomenal occurrences to be mental phenomena, we're making just as much of an inference. If I'm saying that, you know, that this is a representation, or that, you know, there's a self looking at something or perceiving something, you know, there's a self perceiving a representation, in saying anything like that, there's an inference beyond what is directly present in the phenomenal experience itself. And so I don't know whether this is really an argument against idealism, but it's something that I think some idealists tend to overlook, right? That there's just as much of, you know, an inference or as I say, even a leap of faith involved in their position as there is to the postulation of material objects. But of course that depends on, you know, the idealist in question, and it depends on the arguments they're using. But this is a point that I think is sometimes overlooked. So I guess that's not really an answer to your question, but that's what you're going to get. Number two, what are your favourite arguments against necessary being? It's interesting you say favourite arguments, actually, because one's favourite argument isn't necessarily the argument that one finds convincing, right? I mean, I have a lot of arguments I really love that I think are just kind of crazy, But okay, in the case of necessary being, I would say that modal properties, properties of necessity and contingency, are just features of our models, not features of the world. There is no metaphysical modality. The idea that something could have, necessity somehow built into it just makes no sense in my view. Number 3, what do you think about post-analytical rejection of objective truth? Well, I don't know what that means. I personally, I wouldn't say that truth is objective in the sense of mind independent, at least. Truth is a relation between representations in the world, where that relation is constructed by us. But whether my position is I'm not post-analytical. I would identify very much with the analytic tradition. I'm just not sure what this is actually in reference to. So I can't really comment much on it. But I can say, with respect to the idea of objective truth, okay, so number 1, truth is dependent on standards of evaluation, and we have to fix those standards. So when I say something like the table is flat, what counts as flatness, right? What are the conditions required? How precise does this have to be in order for that statement to be true? Because obviously any surface is going to have some bumps and ridges and so on. When I say that the table is flat, if I'm just putting objects on the table, like a computer and a cup and a phone and a keyboard, well, the table I've currently got in front of me is flat. On the other hand, if I'm doing a precision physics experiment, then it's not going to count. So we have to determine the relevant respects and degrees of similarity when fixing the standards for what counts as truth. The second point is that any proposition we express is going to invoke some sort of classification scheme, but all classifications are constructed by us, all of them are dependent on our interests, and all of them involve some sort of simplification or idealization. So to say that a statement is true is to say, or to say that a proposition is true, or a model or whatever, is to say that it matches the world, right? But the world isn't just given to us, we carve it up. When we talk about a proposition matching the world, we're really comparing one model with another. That, in a nutshell, is the kind of line I would want to take on this. So I don't really buy the idea of objective truth, but whether that has anything to do with the post-analytical rejection of objective truth, I can't say. But that's my take on objective truth. Okay then, somebody, again with a Greek or Russian or something name, says, where are you on the political compass? Way down. O says, I remember you once saying you don't like Wittgenstein. Was wondering why. I don't like this question. It is true. I don't like Wittgenstein. But I don't have any sophisticated arguments about Wittgenstein. I wish I did, because then I could just be like, I hate Wittgenstein for these reasons, and I can't do that. I don't have good enough reasons to really justify going around saying that I hate Wittgenstein. Look, I think he was a terrible writer. His ideas seem to me very confused. I think he just isn't good at presenting his ideas. If in the case of in the case of good philosophers, or at least most good philosophers, I think that you read their book. If you were to ask a bunch of other philosophers to read their book, then you'd get slightly different, but basically the same account of what it is they were doing and what their positions were, and they'd probably agree. If I take, say, language, truth, and logic, I can show 10 philosophers language, truth, and logic, ask them what it means, and they'll all say basically the same thing. And if A.J. Ayer were alive, he'd basically agree with the interpretations of these other philosophers. On the other hand, with Wittgenstein, you take something like the Tractatus, you're going to get 10 different interpretations of what's going on there, And if Wittgenstein were alive, he'd get mad and, you know, attack all of them with a poker for misinterpreting him, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating it, but the Tractatus is just awful. It's unreadable. It's just consists of a host of these like declarations without any real argument. So I don't like that part of Wittgenstein. As for late Wittgenstein, yeah, I don't know. He just seems to kind of miss the point of a lot of philosophical debates. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think you can dissolve philosophical problems by attending to language. Also, a lot of the central claims about language that he makes seem to me to have been adequately refuted by later developments by people like Grice, the semantics pragmatics distinction. Yeah, man, I don't know. I don't like Wittgenstein, but there's not really a sophisticated reason why. And there has also been plenty of good work done by people developing Wittgenstein's ideas. Maybe Wittgenstein was okay. He's just overrated. I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't give you a good answer to that question. Okay, A Peripatetic says, "How are you?" Well, you know what? It's been a bad year. It has been a bad year, not because of COVID. I mean, obviously, yeah, the virus sucks, and I oppose things like lockdowns for ideological reasons. But actually, it hasn't really made much difference to me. I'm very happy just sitting in my room. So, in terms of my own life, coronavirus has been like whatever. No, the reason why it's been a bad year for me is my mum died of cancer, and I was very close to my mum. You know, I still lived with her when I wasn't at university, at least. Obviously, when I was at university, I'd go away. But other than that, you know, my mum was fantastic. I still lived with her. She died, so it's been a pretty bad year, and it was protracted as well because it was a long illness. There's that quote, actually, isn't there, in Chernobyl? One of the characters gets cancer, and he says, "They call it the long illness. It doesn't seem very long to me." And actually, I was just reflecting on it. No, it did not actually seem very long in the end. But also, I'm kind of getting a little bit bored with the PhD work now. It's like I've been doing the same topic for over 2 years. I feel in my head like I want to move on, do other things, do other topics. Like I want to just get it done. I'm kind of in the stage now where this isn't fun anymore. It is just work, right? So these two things, I've sort of gotten a little bit bored with my work. I mean, I still love philosophy. I still love the topic, all of that. But it's just that specific work that I'm doing on my PhD. I'm kind of ready to move on from it. So yeah, there's all this stuff happening, which has made this not such a good year. But other than that, I'm pretty damn good. Okay, Ghosts says somebody is about to be tortured. It will be excruciating, but they will survive. Now, which action is more ethical? Successfully help them escape, or turn them into a masochist prior to the torture? It seems really obvious to me that helping them escape is the better option. I mean, there's no drawbacks to helping them escape, right? Like, unless you've left something out of this scenario, obviously you should successfully help them escape if that's what you can do. On the other hand, turning someone into a masochist, that's really bad. Like, unless that's what they want, unless that's what they ask you to do, imposing that kind of transformative change on another person, that just seems terrible to me. It would be better to do nothing, right? Like, at least as far as I'm concerned. I think that, you know, either just letting somebody be tortured and letting them experience pain, or turning them into a masochist so that maybe they enjoy the torture. I mean, I mean, is that even likely to be successful, actually? Because, I mean, there are different contexts in which pain can be applied to somebody, right? Even masochists generally aren't going to enjoy being actually tortured. But, you know, even if you could guarantee that the masochism would make them enjoy the torture, no, I don't think you should impose a change like that on somebody. And I mean, even if you're looking at this from a purely like utilitarian sort of view, where we're just, you know, weighing the pleasures and pains of their lives, bear in mind that in the long run, if you turn someone into a masochist, that might really screw up their lives. It might screw up their relationship. I mean, you're going to radically change their tastes, right? So how is that going to affect things in the long run? I can't see this as even approaching an ethical dilemma. It seems obvious that between those two choices, you should help them escape. Ghosts also asks, I am currently working on a paper defending the position that artificial persons could have gender. By artificial person, I mean a reasoning and sentient robot. What is your take on this? Yeah, I agree. I see gender as a social category. So, yeah, I don't see any problem applying gender terms to artificial persons. Like, especially if you can have a person just wandering around in society like the rest of us, then yeah, of course, it would be quite natural, I think, to kind of enfold them within our gender categories. So, yeah, I would agree with you on that one. Right. Aaron B Lingwood asks, which thinker, to your knowledge, has the most comprehensive description of consent and coercion? And if you view this as inadequate or unworkable, what would you offer your... That's the end. I'm not sure about the grammatical structure there, but I think I get what you're saying. Okay. I don't know. It's been too long since I've done any reading on that particular topic. I know that one account that always stuck with me, and it's an account that I have found myself appealing to quite a lot in just everyday discussions. When I think about this, is Alan Worthamer's idea that some kind of threat or coercion is such that it undermines consent when you threaten to make somebody worse off relative to where they have a right to be. So, you know, if I was to say, do this or I'll kill you, right, then that's coercive and that undermines consent because you have a right to continue living, right? I'm threatening to make you worse off relative to where you have a right to be. On the other hand, do this or I'll end the relationship is maybe a kind of a shitty thing to say. Certainly that would be a shitty way to put it. You know, if you're saying to somebody, have sex with me or I'll end the relationship. If you were to simply say that, yes, that would be bad. But it's not really coercive because nobody has a right to continue being in a relationship with anybody else, right? At that point, you're just engaging in negotiation. Again, in a very tactless way. So you wouldn't want to... you wouldn't want to put the point in quite those terms, but that would be the message, and I don't see that as being coercive. And it seems like the difference between those cases is that in one case you're depriving somebody of what they have a right to. Of course, the problem with this whole account is, well, what do people have a right to, right? So I don't really like this account, just to be clear, but I do find myself appealing to that in my own reasoning about consent. Like if somebody presents me with a problem or some issue where consent is in question, with respect to coercion at least, yeah, I find myself reasoning in that kind of way, even if I maybe have problems with it. But look, as I say, it's been a while since I've thought about this topic. Also, you know, I think that, you know, consent depends on what it is we're talking about, right? So I've kind of assumed that you have in mind consent with respect to sex, although actually I'm looking at your question and you don't actually say anything about sex. So with respect to sex, I adopt a very liberal sort of account. I think it takes a lot to undermine consent. You know, so being intoxicated, for example, in my view, it's perfectly fine. You know, you can consent quite reasonably to sex even if you're intoxicated. I mean, not like, you know, passed out or something, but somebody can get drunk and then consent to sex. I wouldn't see that as undermining their ability to consent. Similarly, you can apply certain forms of pressure, like, for example, if you don't do this, I will end the relationship. I don't see that as undermining consent. I think part of the reason for this, though, is that I don't see sex as really being a significant thing, right? Like, it's not going to have long-term significant consequences in most cases. I mean, it can do. Obviously, you know, you might contract HIV, but that's relatively rare. If you're just talking about like a standard act of sex, it's not really a big deal. So we don't need strict conditions in place before somebody can consent to it. It's not like, for instance, buying a house or even getting a tattoo. I mean, getting a tattoo, again, I don't see that as being a particularly big thing, especially if it's on a part of your body that is usually covered up, right? I mean, if it's on your face, then I guess it might have more of an impact. But, you know, getting a tattoo on a part of your body, okay, the reason why we say that people shouldn't get tattoos when they're drunk, maybe you can't consent to getting a tattoo when you're drunk, is because this is permanent, it's going to be there basically forever. Although having said that, there are actually ways of removing tattoos, aren't there? I don't know much about tattoos. Let's just pretend that tattoos are permanent. Because they're permanent, because they have that long-term consequence, we raise the standards. Yeah, again, I don't know, maybe this hasn't really answered your question. Sorry about that. I'm just doing the best I can, talking about a topic that I really haven't done any reading on for a long time. So there you go. Okay, absupinhere says, are you an eternalist or presentist? Neither. I'm completely agnostic about that, and I don't even know where to begin in terms of coming up with an answer to it. So I really can't say anything about that. I suspend judgment. Anarcho-Americium, yes or no is your answer to this question? No. Yes, my answer to that question is no. Andrew Martinez, do you think philosophy will have a major focus towards one area or approach in philosophy? I have in mind something like the linguistic turn seen in the past. Well, you know, I'm pretty uncomfortable predicting future trends. So will philosophers kind of turn in, you know, will there be something like the linguistic turn? As uncomfortable as I am predicting future trends, it seems unlikely to me, at least in the near term. And I mean, I guess there are at least two reasons for this, right? So part of it is that it seems like there's an increasing move towards pluralist approaches in many areas of philosophy. So, you know, if you just focus, say, on philosophy of science, then, you know, you can see some philosophers using like more empirical methods. Some philosophers engaging closely with specific sciences. Some philosophers applying tools of experimental philosophy. Some philosophers are trying to apply things from other traditions, you know, maybe continental traditions. You know, like if you and you see this over many different areas of philosophy, this increasing pluralism, this increasing tendency to try to bring other methods into our toolbox, other tools into our toolbox, I should say. The idea is no longer that there is like one philosophical method. More and more people seem to be thinking there are many ways of doing philosophy. A second factor is that there's increasing academic specialization. So the result of that is that even if there was some turn towards a specific method in one area of philosophy, I think it would be less likely to spread to other areas, right? So even if in philosophy of science, all philosophers, like the majority just decided, okay, we're gonna do philosophy of science in this way, we wouldn't necessarily expect that method to be applied in philosophy of language or ethics or whatever, because of this increasing academic specialization. So yeah, so those I think are two factors that would militate against anything like the linguistic turn, right? Is increasing acceptance of pluralism and increasing academic specialization. But maybe you would look at these two things as themselves being something like the linguistic turn, right? The pluralist turn, maybe. I don't know. Okay, Archie Fisher asks, are you a cup half full kind of guy or a cup half empty kind of guy? Intellectually, very much cup half empty. Life is bad, the world is getting worse, knowledge is beyond our grasp, and so on. In terms of personality, very much cup half full. I just am basically a happy person. Balrog asks, do you think there's a conflict between scientific anti-realism and the historical sciences? Well, I don't see why there would be. Indeed, the general consensus, as I understand it, is that historical sciences are, in certain important ways, less epistemically secure in their claims than the experimental sciences. I mean, there are some, like, this is controversial. There are people who disagree with this. Adrian Curry recently released a book, Rock, Bone and Ruin, where he argues against this position, right? But it seems like there's a general consensus that historical sciences are less epistemically secure. So one reason for this is that in historical sciences we can't perform manipulative experiments. So Ian Hacking said about was it electrons? If you can spray them, then they're real. Well, obviously you can't spray dinosaurs. You can't do anything else to dinosaurs either. So things that are in the past, we can't manipulate them. The Earth has a history. We can't take the Earth, right, and make lots of different copies of it, and then run the tape of life from, say, the Cambrian on 1,000 different copies of the Earth, right? We can't. So we can't do these repeating experiments. We can't do repeating trials, and we can't actually go into the past and manipulate things. So we have these ways of learning about the very small, about like particles and so on, that just can't apply in the case of historical sciences. Also, with historical sciences, our background theories will tell us all sorts of ways in which evidence has just deteriorated, because we know that historical processes destroy information. And what our background theories tend to tell us is that they tend to reveal ways in which information has been lost. Right? This leads to problems with actually figuring out how to perform tests and how to check that our novel predictions are correct and so on. Historical sciences tend not to produce laws, right? They're more narrative. So there's all of these factors which I think have led some people to think, okay, we're on shakier ground when we make inferences in the case of historical sciences. So it looks like we might actually have a better case for scientific anti-realism in that context, right? Now, where there might be a conflict, so yeah, you said, do you think there's a conflict between scientific anti-realism and historical sciences? Where there might be a conflict, I guess, is if you take something like constructive empiricism. Van Frassen says science aims for theories that are adequate to the observable phenomena, theories that are true for the observable. And he understands observable to mean like observable at any point, right? Anywhere at any point, right? So the observable includes the past. And I don't know, maybe there's some conflict there, because you might say, well, why should we be assuming that scientific theories concerning things in the deep past, right, concerning even observable things in the deep past are true for those observables? We can't actually observe them. But, we can just alter our definition of observability to deal with that. So that's not really a serious conflict. Yeah. Second question. I remember you having 3 different copies of Against Method in your bookshelf tour. What do you find interesting and philosophically valuable in Feyerabend? Well, Feyerabend was a genuine radical with really challenging arguments. Anybody with an interest in philosophy of science, or anybody who has individualist inclinations, should read Feyerabend. It really, on the one hand, he had these really challenging ideas. He challenged a lot of what people had just taken for granted about the sciences, but he clearly loves science, right? His love of science really shines through, and his individuality and contrarianism really shines through. Also, his account of rationality has been a pretty big influence on me. He adopted positions that were kind of dangerous, right? He genuinely had some dangerous ideas. And he's an enormously entertaining writer. I just look. He's got lots of good ideas, and he expresses them very well. And his personality, his contrarianism and mischievousness, just shines through in all his work. So that's why I love Feyerabend. You ask also, what do you think are some of the most interesting trends in contemporary philosophy of science? I had a bit of a think about this, and I don't know. This is a question that I should be able to give a good answer to. But look, I want to give honest answers to these questions. And honestly, I don't know. And I feel terrible that I don't know the answer to that, because philosophy of science is what I do. And I pay attention to what's going on in contemporary philosophy of science. And I should be able to say, okay, here are the things that I particularly like. But I can't. And I think that it's maybe just because my actual interests, if I'm being honest, the things that interest me are the older debates. I mean, obviously, I'm really interested in the realism, anti-realism debate. And I, in my PhD work, I'm obviously focusing on more recent developments, but I've chosen topics that basically allow me to talk about realism, anti-realism. And this is an old debate. That's been going on for decades. And so, I don't know, maybe my interests are just with those older questions rather than with contemporary developments. That there really isn't anything that strikes me. I do like Hasok Chang's idea of complementary science, right? That we can use philosophy and history of science to uncover things that had perhaps been forgotten. His work on temperature, he uncovered lots of these fascinating experiments in the history of the development of the concept of temperature that had kind of been forgotten. And this ended up actually advancing the science itself, the science of temperature and the science of boiling and melting. But the thing is, I don't really do that. That's not something I do, and it's also not. I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that there are large numbers of people who are doing this as well as Chang did it. And maybe that's not even contemporary anymore, because inventing temperature was 2004, so over 15 years ago now. Yeah, sorry, I should have an answer to that question, and I don't. Are you interested in any non-Western philosophical traditions? Not particularly. Ben asks, what university did you attend and what did you major in? University of Exeter, philosophy. Bilbo Swaggins asks, do you think non-cognitivism is still a tenable position despite the Frege-Geach problem? Okay, so, I mean, first of all, there are a whole load of responses to the Frege-Geach problem. It's been going on for decades, right? So yeah, there are people defending non-cognitivism. There are people who are dealing with the Frege-Geach problem. Lots of different ways of thinking about that have emerged. For my own views on this, so first of all, just to be clear, right, how I understand non-cognitivism is simply as the claim that moral claims are neither true nor false. And, more precisely, whereas beliefs, say, have a mind-to-world direction of fit, whereas in the case of a belief, you have a mental representation that's trying to match the world, moral claims have a world-to-mind direction of fit, right? You want to bring the world in line with the representation. So moral claims are tools to express desires, attitudes, plans. Okay, now, with respect to the Frege-Geach problem, I guess I should say something about my general approach when it comes to metaethics. So I think that a lot of the literature here rests on a mistaken view of language, specifically the assumption that there are determinate, precise facts about the meanings of our statements. My view is that actual moral language is just vague and incoherent, right? It's sometimes moral statements express beliefs, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's just no determinate fact to the matter either way. Like I'm quite happy to grant that there are plenty of people who will say something like abortion is wrong, and they mean to be attributing the property of wrongness to abortion, and so their statement is invaluable in terms of its truth or falsity, and it's false, right, in that case. So that would be a kind of error theory view. But moral language is a lot. There's much more just going on than that. It's when we try to develop an account of moral language, part of what we are doing is giving an account of a much broader practice, right? Like, it's not just the statements that we have to account for, it's the whole practice in which those statements occur. It's the reasons why we are giving those statements. I think that when we give a theory of the meaning of moral statements, there isn't really going to be a way of coherently capturing our actual moral discourse. It's too messy, too vague, confused, incoherent. But that isn't really a problem, because what we can do is clean it up, right? So we can pursue something that's a bit more, we can pursue a project that's less descriptive and more prescriptive. We can alter, clarify, explicate moral concepts. And so my approach to non-cognitivism is within that general framework, right? I'm proposing non-cognitivism as an explication of our moral concepts. So I can grant that actual moral discourse is very often cognitivist, right? That people are really trying to attribute the property of wrongness or the property of goodness or whatever to particular actions. But actual moral discourse is defective. Non-cognitivism, non-cognitivist analysis provides the repair. We should use moral language to express attitudes, emotions, desires, plans, and so on. Mental states with a world-to-mind direction of fit. So that I guess is the background. And obviously, within that kind of framework, something like the Frege-Geach problem, hopefully you can see that it's going to have somewhat less force, right? Because the question is just going to be whether we can, can we then come up with a way of making sense of embedding, right? Even if that's not how those statements actually work in our discourse as it currently is. I think it's fairly easy to account for the embedding of moral statements. So let's take some non-moral statements first of all. Grass is green, right? We have a statement, grass is green, that straightforwardly expresses a belief, we might say, and then you can embed it. I wonder whether grass is green. Frank says that grass is green. If grass is green, then grass is coloured, etc. Now, from this, we can draw out a kind of abstract structure. So from grass is green, I can go to grass is X. And from I wonder whether grass is green, I go to I wonder whether grass is X. So grass is X, I wonder whether grass is X. Frank says that grass is X. If grass is X, then grass is Y. and so on. We do this kind of thing all the time when talking about logical structures. If you talk about the structure of an argument, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Now, notice that obviously grass is X is not true or false. It doesn't express a proposition, but still we can take that and embed it and talk about certain logical properties and so on. Now my point, my claim would then be, okay, well, we can now just take our predicate wrong and plug it into these kinds of structures. The question is what's going on with that term wrong, right? And I say it expresses a desire, not a belief as such. Something like murder is wrong is neither true nor false, but of course there's no real issue with saying I wonder whether murder is wrong, just as you can say I wonder whether grass is green. Right. I don't know if that answers your question. What was your question? Do you think non-cognitivism is still tenable despite... Yes, I think non-cognitivism is still tenable. Borders asks, do you think there are any satisfying accounts of the philosophy of mathematics? I don't know philosophy of mathematics well enough to comment, so nope, can't answer that one. Which is the philosopher you least understand others' admiration for, and conversely, which philosopher, if any, do you most admire that is generally not well regarded? Well, for philosophers that I least understand others' admiration for, of course there are lots of philosophers in other philosophical traditions that I don't work in. I guess I shouldn't really use any of those, right? There are some philosophers that I just think I don't get the point of this, or it just seems incoherent, or stupid, or crazy, or pretentious sometimes. So yeah, there's the Heideggers and Derridas and Hegels, right? But they're working in other traditions, and I kind of feel that I should have some epistemic humility and sort of say, well, I haven't been educated in this, so I maybe shouldn't comment. Within the analytic tradition, then, well, maybe Wittgenstein. And I had a question earlier from somebody who asked me, why don't I like Wittgenstein? And as I said in response to that person, I don't have any sophisticated reason. Look, Wittgenstein, very, very popular in analytic philosophy. I don't find him even remotely impressive. He also seemed to be a terrible person. He's a shithead. He was an awful person, which makes his fame doubly strange. Because, generally speaking, if you want to succeed in any kind of field, you've got to be good at the networking stuff. And I don't know how Wittgenstein succeeded at that, because he just seemed to be awful. I in many ways do not understand people's admiration for him. Who I admire who is not well regarded, well, I suppose I could say someone like Feyerabend, who's basically my favourite philosopher. He gets a lot of criticism, but he's controversial, right? I mean, he's actually a pretty well-known figure. I really like the work of Andrei Kukla. He's covered a very wide range of topics in his work. Some of them outside the scope of normal analytic philosophy. He's done work on ineffability and work on extraterrestrials, which are topics that don't tend to get much attention from analytic philosophers. So he's done a wide range of work. He's always very rigorous, very careful argumentation, and I mean they're very sophisticated arguments, clever arguments. He's got a lot of good insights, but he doesn't seem to get much attention. I mean, he's not hated, right? He's just sort of unknown. And I guess if I could pick a philosopher who I do really like, who seems to be relatively unknown, it'd probably be Andrei Kukla. I really like what he does, but I don't see people talk about him that often. Even within philosophy, he doesn't seem to get a lot of attention. Chitransh Srivastav, that's my best attempt at pronouncing that. Apologies if I've got it wrong. Says, give your views on veganism. Are you vegan? Well, I don't find the arguments for veganism convincing. I mean, there are basically two issues, right? One is animal rights, one is the environment. Now, concerning animals, I just don't care. I don't care about them. So the animal rights arguments don't move me. About the environment, I do care a lot about that. Obviously, I have self-interested reasons to care about that. The issue with environmentalist arguments for veganism is that there's simply no way to move from... like, we can say there's an obligation to reduce environmental impact, let's say. But there's no way to move from that to an obligation to refrain from consuming animal products. The only way to make that move would be to say that people are obligated to do everything they can. But that's clearly absurd because you'd have to kill yourself, right? Like that's the best thing you can do for the environment is just to stop living, right? So, when we say that people are obligated to reduce their environmental impact, there's lots of different ways of achieving that, lots of different things they can do. Yes, eliminating animal products would be one way of doing that, but there are other things you might do as well. For instance, I have not and will not reproduce. As such, I've already done much more than a vegan who has reproduced. So yeah, there's lots of things that you can do. You might continue eating meat as much as ever, but change other aspects of your life, or you might reduce meat consumption while also changing some other aspects of your life, or you might go vegan. Any of those are ways of reducing environmental impact. So yeah, I'm not convinced by the arguments for veganism. Now, having said that, I'm also not really inclined to talk about this topic in too much detail. So I want to just answer your question, right? So I'm putting my reasons out there for you. I don't want to go into this in much detail for a couple of reasons. The first is that I do think the world would be much better if everybody were vegan. Honestly, I would be quite happy to see the meat industry just completely abolished. It is basically terrible in every way. The environmental devastation, the ag-gag laws, the fucking terrible arguments that meat eaters will use to defend it. I mean, you talk to a meat eater about animal rights, right? You will get the worst, just the stupidest shit that is imaginable will come out of their mouths in order to defend their behaviour. Just to be absolutely clear about this, right? Like, I can keep on eating animals reasonably because I'm, for dependent reasons, willing to endorse conclusions that most people would find utterly horrifying, right? But like you cannot have. I just don't think there's any reasonable way of endorsing any kind of animal rights while at the same time continuing to eat animals. It's ridiculous, right? And that's what most meat eaters will do. Most meat eaters want to say that we should actually have some concern for the welfare of animals, but the meat industry is an exception for reasons X, Y, Z, or it's okay to kill them for reasons X, Y, Z, or whatever. Those arguments are terrible, I think, and so just because of the poor quality of their arguments, I would be happy to see their meat industry abolished, and then laugh in their faces. So yeah, that's one reason, right? I actually don't care. I'm happy for the vegans to win this one, so I'm not particularly concerned about trying to argue against them. The second reason why I'm not inclined to argue about this in any detail is that YouTube's community guidelines make it basically impossible to discuss many of the arguments for animal rights. The marginal cases argument, for example, if you look up the community guidelines, particularly the hate speech policy on YouTube, you cannot talk about that argument. You cannot present that argument. There's a lot of vegans and animal rights communities on YouTube, right? I don't know why they haven't spoken out about YouTube's guidelines on this, but I'm not going to risk the survival of my channel just to talk about this topic that frankly I don't care that much about anyway. That's why I'm not going to go into detail, particularly with respect to the animal rights argument. But I will say, the usual ways that meat eaters try to defend their practice are obviously stupid. So, okay, next question from you is, what are your views on new atheist anti-religion movement? Well, in terms of the philosophical arguments, I'm not sure there's anything particularly new here. Indeed, many of them are quite unsophisticated philosophically. So I recently did a video with Cole on, it's called Why Sam Harris is Always Wrong, that I did with my friend Cole Nazarella. And that title is a bit of a joke because actually we only talk about his argument concerning the Azort gap, and so actually that's not really even relevant to the new atheist stuff, at least not directly. It's not about his anti-religion stuff, but it is an example of how philosophically unsophisticated some of the major figures here are. It's also, I don't like how it seems to be coupled very often to a dismissive attitude to philosophy. I recall a debate, I think it was Peter Atkins, chemist Peter Atkins, did on the existence of God. And in the course of this debate, it was the Q&A section, and somebody asked him a question about philosophy, and he basically said, philosophy is useless. I think he was like, well, maybe philosophers have got some use in presenting tricky ethical dilemmas, but that's it, right? Philosophy is just a waste of time. And the crowd applauded. I remember this so clearly. I'm thinking, you've got this guy who is at a public debate on the existence of God, right, saying that philosophy is useless. And you've got an audience of people who have paid, presumably, to go and watch this debate, applauding his claim that philosophy is useless. It's bizarre, right? Especially because the existence of God is, quite frankly, it's a topic that many philosophers have kind of moved on from. It's, a lot of philosophers actually find that topic a little bit, it's a bit old hat, right? We've kind of moved on from it. At least in many philosophers have. Obviously, there are plenty of philosophers who still find it engaging, and that's fine. But even so, it's like you're dealing with a very traditional philosophical topic here, and applauding the idea that philosophy is useless. It's very strange. Even the philosophers who are involved in this movement can be unsophisticated in this kind of way. So again, another debate I saw was between Alex Rosenberg and William Lane Craig. I only watched this debate because I really like Alex Rosenberg. He's brilliant. He's a philosopher of biology. He's done fantastic work. His book, Instrumental Biology and the Disunity of Science, has been a big influence on my views. So when I saw he was doing this debate, I thought I would check it out, and oh man, it was like cringe-inducingly bad on Rosenberg's part. He didn't, as far as I recall, he made like the most elementary errors. He didn't seem to understand the distinction between the evidential and logical problems of evil, for instance. I might be misremembering, right? That might not have been the mistake he made. I know that he made very elementary errors, like literally, 101 level errors. And it was something like he didn't get the distinction between the logical and evidential problems of evil. Something like that. But again, I might be misremembering the details. The new atheist movement is, philosophically speaking, not impressive. And I think it has led to genuine misunderstandings of philosophy. So yeah, in that respect, it's kind of bad. But then at the same time, you know, we are dealing with something that is a fairly broad social movement involving people from lots of disciplines. And so yes, there are philosophically unsophisticated arguments being presented, but on the other hand, you know, there's Dan Dennett was a major figure. He's a good philosopher. As a broader social movement, I basically have to support it. I mean, religion is complete horseshit. It is almost every religion will promote utterly nonsensical metaphysical views. They will promote the most repugnant moral positions. They promote dogmatic thinking and mob mentality. It's just horrible. I think it should be purged from civil society and from other kinds of society as well. You should be embarrassed to be religious. So there you go. That's my actual opinion. Sorry, I think it's horrible bullshit, and I'm stating it in a way that is not very diplomatic. So, you know, that's what you're getting right now, is me in a somewhat more militant mood. But yeah, I so as a kind of social movement that rejects religion, it's good. But I just wish that it could maybe be a bit more philosophically sophisticated, and like, don't pretend that, you know, God is like a scientific hypothesis that is refuted by science. That's silly. Okay, yeah. Conrado Vasconcelos asks, number 1, according to the Neckbeard Society blogspot, you are the society's current president, but you don't have a neckbeard anymore. How do you feel about this? Well, you know, the neckbeard, it was great while it lasted, but I had to accept that it was too wild, too challenging, too radical for current society to understand and appreciate. But one day I will be looked upon as a pioneer for the work that I did in bringing back the neckbeard. People will see me as a genius, even for what I did there. I have no doubt about that. Number 2, do you have any strong opinions on how philosophy teaching should be done, and what's most valuable when teaching philosophy to someone? Well, not particularly. I would have thought that the best pedagogical methods would depend on the particular students that you're dealing with, you know, what their sort of general level of education is, and also on the particular philosophical subject. There aren't going to be general methods for this. I mean, I do think that one very valuable tool, which you don't get doing it on YouTube, is discussion and debates and conversation. So, you know, I do my best to teach the philosophy on YouTube, but there is one thing that unfortunately you can't get from like YouTube lectures, which is, you know, groups of people actually just having conversations with each other. And I do think that I suppose you can do it a little bit in the comments, but genuine conversation, I think, is valuable. I do think that the seminar room is where people really learn how to do philosophy. So yeah, I guess I have a strong opinion on that one. Number 3, what's your position towards the question of the nature of genuine philosophical problems? I don't understand the question. Are you asking what's your position towards the question of the nature of genuine philosophical problems? So are you asking what are the criteria for something to be a genuine philosophical problem? Like, is this a question of, okay, what's a genuine philosophical problem as opposed to, say, a scientific problem, or as opposed to, say, a pseudo-philosophical problem? I mean, I don't really know how to demarcate philosophy from other subjects. I think philosophy tends to, I mean, actually, there isn't a strict demarcation. It tends to overlap with other subjects. We tend to be, pursuing. So in some cases, we may be pursuing similar questions to the sciences, but we're just using different methods, but not necessarily completely different methods, because there will be overlap in terms of the methodology. I don't think we can really neatly demarcate philosophy from other things. So yeah, other than that, I'm not sure what you'd be getting at there. Okay, conundrum. Increasing numbers of thinkers are tackling the problem of the modern meaning crisis. We seem to be lacking any purpose in our lives. We don't know how to understand the world. We don't have a viable grand narrative to order the world for us. What's your take on this problem? I don't think it's a problem. So, human lives, you say we seem to be lacking any purpose in our lives. Yeah, that's right. Human lives in general don't have any purpose. Purposes are attributed to things by particular agents. So, the purpose of a hammer is to drive in nails, because that's why it was created. We built hammers to do that thing. But humans weren't created by anyone for anything. We just evolved. It's blind, for a blind process. There is no general purpose. There is no general meaning. But more importantly, let's just pretend that there was, right? Let's say that humans were created to fulfill some sort of purpose. Who cares, right? Why does it matter? Why does that make any difference to anything? So I can imagine that some powerful creator made us for a purpose, but why would that matter to me? What if the creator's purposes or the creator's desires conflicted with our desires, right? I mean, we can imagine a creator that is maybe built the world in order to test some sort of experiment, right? And maybe they created human society for the purpose of just finding out an answer. Maybe they were performing an experiment in order to find general laws concerning the development of intelligent societies, right? So they created, right, the Earth and humans on it in order to test their theory, right? So we have a purpose then, right? There is a purpose for the existence of humans. That's what? How does that change anything? How does that affect our lives at all? I mean, it doesn't, right? We can postulate purposes. We can postulate, a grand narrative of which we are a part, but we still face the question of, okay, why should we care about this, right? Why should we comply with it, right? If it's involving commands or whatever. I think at the end of the day, it is up to each individual to decide how to live their life, and that's the case even if there is a purpose to human life as a whole. Even if there is some meaning or grand narrative or purpose, it's ultimately still up to you what to do, right? It's up to you to figure out the purposes of your own life. So for me personally, I don't think of my life as having a purpose. I think that particular actions and projects that I engage in have purposes, but I wouldn't see my life as a whole as having a purpose. Some people claim to, at least some people claim to think of their life as a whole as having a purpose. Maybe your purpose is to improve the world, right? Leave the world in a better state than which you found it. Maybe that's the purpose of your life. But that's something that is constructed by the individual. It is up to you to decide whether or not that is a reasonable purpose for your life. So different individuals will have different purposes. There is no cosmic purpose, no grand narrative, and even if there was, it wouldn't make any difference to anything. So I don't think that what you have described as a problem there is actually a problem. Crofty Wutz. What happened to you after your relationship video? Did it help you find someone? No, it didn't, but I did get back together with my previous girlfriend, so the relationship video was useless, but you know, I'm good now. Danky Doodle asks, what is your favourite colour? Let's go with lilac. Declan Carpenter, what are your thoughts on omniliberalism? Well, I had never heard of omniliberalism, so before I did this, I looked it up, just so I have something to say about it. I found an omniliberal manifesto on Reddit, and let me just actually quote the relevant sections, because I'm not sure this is really what you have in mind. So, it has a Q&A section, and it says this, and I quote, question, isn't this, where this is omniliberalism, so isn't omniliberalism basically just social democracy / neoliberalism / Nordic model? Answer, yeah, pretty much. The omniliberal name just gets rid of some of the baggage the other ideologies have received. So yeah, this is stupid, right? The already existing terms are perfectly adequate. It's just confusing to talk about omniliberalism, right? That's it. I think ridiculous. I mean, like, you can go ahead if you want. I guess you can call things whatever you want, but people are just going to be confused by what you're talking about. It's misleading. I can't see any advantage in adopting this terminology. Also, actually, so it says that the omniliberalism is basically just social democracy / neoliberalism / Nordic model. Is that, are those the same thing? Because here in the UK, neoliberalism refers to the kind of like deregulation associated with Thatcher. I wouldn't associate it with the more robust welfare systems of the Nordic model. But maybe omniliberalism is just trying to capture many different kinds of liberalism. Maybe that's the point. So like an omniliberal is just somebody who's like generally in support of liberalism, right? It's like, yeah, we'll go with capitalism. We'll have some welfare provisions, right? Maybe really robust welfare state. Maybe more deregulation. Maybe less of a welfare state. Who cares? Right, maybe that's what omniliberalism is. I don't know. This does not seem particularly interesting to me. Okay, don't you fucking uwu me. I don't know how to pronounce uwu, but that's what it looks like. You've come up with a very creative interpretation of my request to limit it to 3 or 4 questions. I approve. So I will. Yeah, I'll try to go through some of these. Okay, number 1, thoughts on science wars, science studies, and the social hoax. Well, okay, yeah, thoughts on that. Well, first of all, you know, there's an odd combination of combatants in this particular in the science wars, right? Because so who are the constructivists and the postmodernists that the pro-science people were objecting to? Well, on the one hand, you had the kind of continental literary crowd. Yeah, you had the people who were kind of producing a lot of almost incomprehensible literature, which in which they would, you know, use scientific language, but actually there's just a total failure to understand science, right? And so this is detailed in books like Fashionable Nonsense, which is very amusing. They go through a whole bunch of scholars who have used scientific or mathematical or logical language, but just clearly have no idea what they are talking about, and it's really pretentious and incomprehensible, right? So you've got that sort of literary continental sort of side of the constructivists. On the other hand, there's the science studies people, many of whom have produced very serious and very interesting work. So take, say, David Bloor, right? His book Knowledge and Social Imagery is, I guess, the the opening salvo, right? Like that was the cannon. That was the first piece of cannon fire on the constructivist side. It is a brilliant, brilliant book. It's well worth reading. It's really clearly written. It's accessible. Like he knows what he's talking about, and he communicates in a very straightforward, very accessible way. And it's also got this like hard-nosed naturalist materialism, right? It's hardcore materialist naturalism. It's really striking, because because you think of constructivists as being wishy-washy, anti-science. Like Bloor's book is constructivist, I guess maybe even postmodernist, but it's like hardcore naturalism. Bloor wants a science of science, right? He wants to account for scientific change in purely causal, non-normative terms, and that's analogous to like what we do when we're doing science in other contexts, right? So we account for the emergence of humanity, we account for the origin of the human species, and we develop a purely causal model. We're not saying that humans are in any sense better than, well, they're better in the sense that they're better able to survive and reproduce, right? But they're not like normatively good. We can account for this in purely causal terms. Again, Bloor wants the same for the study of science. He wants to account for the emergence of scientific theories in purely causal terms. So in traditional sociology of science, the way that you proceed is by causally explaining the false theories, right? So for phrenology, you will appeal to social factors, various non-rational factors as leading to the acceptance of this theory. But when it comes to the true theories, like if you want to explain why do people accept Maxwell's electrodynamics, well, that's not really a subject for sociological modelling, right? Because you just say scientists accepted that theory because it was true, right? They just followed the correct canons of method. So there's this distinction in how traditional sociologists treated science, where you would give sociological models to account for the acceptance of false theories, but for the true theories you just say, scientists are following the normatively correct methods. Bloor wants to do away with that, right? He wants to say, no, we account for all theories in the same kind of way, in purely causal terms. And ultimately that's what leads Bloor to challenge traditional ways of thinking about knowledge and truth and rationality and so on, and it leads him to this constructivist position. But it's completely different to the constructivism of the continental literary crowd. And so I suppose that one thing I would say about the science wars is just I think that there's been some obscuring of who exactly the fighting is between. And I found it very interesting to actually, when I actually read the work of people on the constructivist side, just how much, I mean, it's not just Bloor, Harry Collins, his book Changing Order, one of my favourite books, where he presented the experimenter's regress. It's a fascinating argument. Trevor Pinch has done some brilliant stuff. Barry Barnes. I mean, these are people who clearly understand science very, very well, and they are approaching it from a what actually kind of seems like a very scientific point of view. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Oh, and the Sokol hoax, meaningless. I don't think anything really follows. It doesn't tell us anything. Like, it points to the fact that maybe there's problems in like journal publishing, but actually those problems occur everywhere, not just in sociology and anthropology and literary fields, right? Problems like that occur everywhere, as demonstrated by, for instance, the Bogdanov hoax, where a couple of it wasn't actually a hoax, because I don't think the Bogdanovs were trying to, I think actually the Bogdanovs weren't they weren't hoaxing. They actually thought that their views were right, but they basically came up with, I think they published 5 papers or something, some of them in reputable physics journals that were just full of complete nonsense. And so, if the Sokol hoax affair shows that the constructivists don't know what they're doing, then it looks like we've also got some pretty good reason to think physicists don't know what they're doing. But actually, no, the issue is just with journals in many academic fields. Okay, thoughts on Jordan Peterson? Well, my initial exposure to Jordan Peterson was, I would say, moderately positive, because I first encountered him when I heard about him, that there was the controversy about free speech on university campuses, and I saw the video of Jordan Peterson attempting to give a speech about something, and there were loads of people around him blasting air horns in his face, preventing him from speaking, which is appalling. Like, I'm on his side, okay? So that was my initial exposure to Jordan Peterson. So I'm saying that so that you know that my initial feelings about him were basically positive. I'm with you on this one, okay? The fact that universities let the students get away with that is disgusting, okay? So yeah, free debate is really important. I'm with him on that. Everything else that I have come across with respect to Peterson, right, has reduced my opinion of him, and yeah, I do not like the guy for several reasons. So, first of all, right, I think that just in terms of his actual, like, the positions that he's actually promoting, I think they're just really shallow. As far as I can tell, his views basically amount to kind of bog standard Christian conservatism, and I mean, there's nothing like, okay, whatever. I mean, he has views that are fairly widely held. I'm not going to go around saying like, this guy's a fascist or anything, but it's not very interesting. What bothers me though is that he disguises his shallow and uninteresting views with this like veneer of incredibly pretentious and obscurantist language. So if you try to get him to talk about God, for example, right, it's just meaningless nonsense. Again, his views, the actual positions he has, I think, seem quite shallow and uninteresting, right? But he just expresses himself in a way that is incomprehensible. And that's not good. That's not good philosophy. That's not good, like, politics, whatever. People should be clear, and they should be precise, and they should make an effort to make their views well known. And if you can't express yourself in ways that other people can understand you, then actually, right, it's not that your views are clever, right? It's that you don't know what you're talking about. So that's one problem. The other problem with Peterson, and this I think is maybe even more of a problem actually, is that he's a liar. He misrepresents his academic credentials when he's talking to the public. That really bothers me, especially because he's constantly making very grand claims about history, philosophy, biology, sociology, economics, right? He is not trained in most of these fields, but he claims to be. There was an interview with him where he claimed to be an evolutionary biologist, and then he followed that up by saying something that revealed he clearly didn't understand anything about how evolutionary biology actually works. So that was quite amusing. But, to somebody watching this who's not within academia, right, you have somebody who actually does have academic credentials. I mean, he is a psychologist. I assume he's done good work in that because he is a professor of psychology, right? So this is somebody within academia who is misrepresenting the academic credentials they actually have, right? And while also making claims about these other subjects, I mean, it's really distasteful. And I mean, some of the stuff he says is like, it's not just distasteful. It's dangerous. I mean, his climate denial and the meat diet stuff. It's ridiculous. So there are lots of things that really bother me about Peterson. Also, I began this by saying the thing about free speech, right? Since then, he himself has attempted to sue people who say mean things about him. So for all of this stuff about free speech, I mean, in fact, it's like, for as much as some people seem to see him as this defender of free speech, that's a load of bollocks. He doesn't even do that very well, because he sues people, right, for saying bad stuff about him. So fuck him. I don't like him at all. There you go. Those are my thoughts on Jordan Peterson. I'm not a fan, and that's not because of any kind of bias. Because, as I say, right, when I first encountered this guy, I was on his side. Okay, thoughts on naturalism. Man, I don't know. Naturalism, that can mean so many different things. You've got to give me something more specific than that. Like, what kind of naturalism? What are we talking about here? Am I a naturalist? I don't know, because I don't know what naturalism in general means. There are so many things that can be meant by that term. What are some of the worst misconceptions about philosophy that people unfamiliar with it, / beginners / scientists have? I don't know. I mean, a lot of people just don't seem to understand what philosophy is. Although I must say it's very hard to remedy that, because I'm not sure I can actually give a definition of philosophy. People ask me, what is philosophy? What is it you do? I always find it very, very hard to answer that question. It's to communicate in simple and accessible terms exactly what it is that the discipline I'm involved in is actually trying to do. That is hard to communicate. But misconceptions, I'm not sure. There's no specific misconception about philosophy that has really struck me. I'm just thinking about, what about among scientists? Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there are. It seems like there are lots of scientists. Well, I say lots. There are some scientists who are quite dismissive of philosophy, I think, without really engaging with it. But again, it's just like, okay, they don't really know. They don't really know the field. I don't know. What are your long-term goals doing philosophy? To do more philosophy, to carry on doing philosophy. That's what I would like to do. I just like philosophy in itself. I'm not doing philosophy in order to achieve some other goal. I'm doing philosophy because I love philosophy, so I want to carry on doing philosophy. Is progress in philosophy and or science, if there is any, exponential? Well, it depends on what you're counting as progress, because there are definitely some changes that are exponential, or at least, were exponential. For example, the number of philosophical and scientific papers published, that increased exponentially. Maybe it's still increasing exponentially, but certainly for a time it increased exponentially. It might be slowing now, but yeah, just the raw number of papers published, right, was increasing exponentially. The raw number of philosophers and scientists working increased exponentially. So there's an exponential change. Does that count as progress? Well, progress is subjective. So, to say that X is better than Y, to say that there is progress is to say that, we have some future state that is better than a past state, and better than is subjective. So it's just a matter of, like, whether or not progress in philosophy and science is exponential is a matter of what you think, what kinds of changes you think count as progressive. What's the best critique and defense of vagueness in philosophy? Well, I don't know what that's in reference to. What is a critique and defense of vagueness? I mean, are there people who think that vagueness just isn't a thing? As far as I know, nobody doubts that there are vague predicates. Like that there are different accounts of vagueness, but there's not like there aren't people who deny that vagueness is a thing, as far as I know. Although, is maybe the epistemic account of vagueness, would that deny that vagueness is... No, because they still accept that there are vague predicates. Yeah. Empty Bug, what do you think about Russian philosophy? I don't know anything about it. ZH, do you think there is no good argument for meta-ethical realism? Well, good arguments. Yeah, actually, there are good arguments. There are interesting arguments. There are no convincing arguments, but an argument doesn't have to be convincing to be good. Number 2, why are you so bad about egalitarianism? Do you think in the future you will change your mind? It's difficult to give a general answer on this because there are many different forms of egalitarianism. There are different things that we might have in mind when we use the word egalitarian. But let me try to say some general things about this. So, egalitarianism, right? What's the general idea? I take it that to be an egalitarian is to say that we are, or society in general is, morally required to provide all people with equal amounts of something or other, right? It may be resources, it may be opportunities, it may be something else, right? But there's this, part of it is a moral requirement to produce this equalization. So now, my own inclinations, my own value inclinations are very strongly individualist. I'm inclined to say at this point that nobody has obligations to do anything in particular for anybody else. Nobody owes anything to anybody else. I care very much about individual liberty. And I don't think that this is likely to change. You asked if I'll change my mind in the future. Obviously, I don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, but I don't think this is likely to change. I know that I've always had that same basic value, right? I've always had that strongly individualist inclination. And insofar as there have been changes in my political views, and there definitely have been changes in my political views, it's been due to changing judgments about how best to realize that value, right? How best to realize the individualist value. It's not because the values themselves have changed. Right. My values are very strongly oriented around individualism, liberty, and at the end of the day, I think Nozick was right. Not in the specific details of his views, but a general thing that he said, was liberty destroys patterns. I think he's right about that. And egalitarianism is a kind of patterning view of justice, right? So there's an incompatibility there. Again, I don't any longer endorse a Nozickian approach to libertarianism, but that basic point that liberty destroys patterns, I think, is probably true. So that's my general perspective, right? As opposed to egalitarianism. Now, another problem that I have with egalitarianism is that there just isn't any significant sense in which equality strikes me as even being morally relevant. So I get the arguments for sufficiency, right, let's say. So I think this has been defended by Harry Frankfurt, for example, right? That what matters is that people have enough of something. So the idea that people should have enough to survive, right? I get the intuition there. That, like, I can see why that matters. I can see why we would say, okay, we want everybody to be in a position where they have enough resources to survive, right? But I just don't get the even the intuition behind why equality might matter. And maybe part of this is because, look, any differences can be modelled as differences, as inequalities, right? Any difference at all is a kind of inequality, because we might in principle aim to equalise any given property. Of course, we may care about, say, equalising access, food resources, say, but you could care about equalising anything. You might want to equalise hair length, for example. You could have that as your aim, right? So any difference at all is a kind of inequality. So social diversity is going to be in tension with equality, broadly speaking. And maybe that's why I don't quite get the intuition even for equality. You know, I also think that many of the conceptions of equality are sort of odd to take as ideals because they're not really coherently realizable, even in principle, for anything like our society. So, you know, we can't really even imagine a coherent hypothetical scenario in which the goal is achieved, where we're assuming anything like the actual world. So if you take something like fair equality of opportunity, where all people have the same prospects for success, well, we know that being born in different locations will alter one's opportunities. Now, we can compensate for that, but it seems to me there's just no way of weighing how much compensation is actually required for equalizing, right? For determining exactly how much compensation puts you in a position where the opportunities are equalized. I mean, again, there are other conceptions of equality, and so other ways of thinking about egalitarianism. But no, I think maybe that gives you a bit of an answer as to why I don't take egalitarianism as one of my fundamental values. Number 3, do you know about the arguments of Cohen, Dworkin, Scanlon? I'm broadly familiar with their work. I mean, certainly Cohen and Dworkin, Scanlon not so much. But Cohen, Dworkin, luck egalitarianism, yes, I'm broadly familiar with that. I don't like it. I think even if I were to adopt an egalitarian perspective, the kind of luck egalitarianism of Cohen and Dworkin just isn't the best way to develop it. What I dislike about it is the moralization. In fact, it seems to me that their take on egalitarianism combines like the worst of the left and the right. So you know, you have that kind of left-wing radical egalitarianism, right? Which I've just explained why I'm not an egalitarian. But then it's combined with this like weirdly moralized idea of desert and responsibility that seems more associated with like right-wing thinking. And you know, in any case, right? I don't think there's actually a coherent distinction between inequalities that flow from bad luck and inequalities that flow from the choices you make, because the choices you make are ultimately a product of the interaction of your genes and environment, and all of that stuff is just luck. You know, so just as you can compensate somebody who is born without legs, living in conditions where the lack of legs makes their life more difficult, you could similarly compensate somebody who is born with a tendency to take stupid risks when they are in such conditions that those risks fail, right? In both cases, what you have is somebody who is a product of the interaction of their genes and their environment. I don't think that concept of responsibility that they're working with can do the job they want it to do. But my main problem with the views of people like Cohen and Dworkin is I don't think that differences, like even if we could make sense of that idea of responsibility, I don't think it actually matters. And I don't think that I also just don't have the intuition that we should equalize or remove differences as a result of luck. Indeed, they seem to me to contribute to the variety of society. Again, the issue for me seems to be more we want to make sure that everybody has enough to have a good life or something like that. But the egalitarian intuition, I don't get. Okay, Frolic Nature. Do you think that freedom has intrinsic value? Are there any good arguments against freedom? Do you know of some good literature on that topic? Well, for arguments against freedom, yeah, you might want to check out my videos on Max Stirner, particularly the video on ownness, because Stirner gives, I think, a very powerful critique of freedom as a value. So yeah, you could check out Stirner or just check out my videos on him. So to answer your question, do you think freedom has intrinsic value? Well, there are no intrinsic values. If by intrinsic value you mean objective value, values are constructed by us, or they're things that we do. They're a product of our attitudes and dispositions. Now, we might be contrasting intrinsic with instrumental, right? So, do I value freedom as something just like valuable? Do I take freedom to be valuable in itself, or do I think, okay, the value of freedom is just with the instrumental utility it provides? Well, that depends on what you mean by freedom. Actually, I've mentioned Stirner. I think a key part and a very important part of Stirner's attack is that actually the concept of freedom just isn't particularly clear or coherent. But if we take freedom to mean something like, okay, we're going to leave other people alone, let them do what they want, well, yeah, that's something that I find intrinsically valuable. That's something I want. Of course, we can debate exactly what that entails. So if I own a field and somebody comes along and starts sleeping in the field, would I be violating their freedom by kicking them out, or are they violating my freedom by sleeping in my field? You get those sorts of debates, right? But the basic idea of, look, let people do what they want to do, that seems intrinsically valuable to me, if anything is. By the way, some people in my surroundings say that authoritarianism and just following orders is better because it leads to societal cohesion, less depression due to less thinking, etc. So, two claims there. Authoritarianism and just following orders leads to societal cohesion, and it leads to less depression because, there's just fewer people thinking critically? Okay, so with respect to societal cohesion, we know that social cohesion does not require centralised authority of any kind, right? I mean, let alone a strong authority, right? It doesn't require centralised supervision. There are plenty of examples of spontaneous order, countless examples throughout human history of various kinds of social cohesion, arising either in the complete absence of any central authority or arising tangentially to it. So, actually in day-to-day lives, there are various ways in which order is created, but where that's not imposed upon us by the state. So the state will have various laws, and that imposes a kind of order. But then there are also other types of order, right? That just in our everyday interactions with other people, we get by just through various social conventions, order arises. And there are, as I say, plenty of examples of kind of societies within societies where they have achieved order through social convention. I did a video with Cole Nazarella on, it's called Anarchy in Action, where she talked about the dark web. This is something that operates without a central authority. It's something that operates really outside the bounds of the state, sometimes outside the bounds of the law. The people on there that, will deal drugs and guns and so on. So there's a lot of illegal activity going on the dark web, but it is very well ordered. It is even kind of regulated, right? It's just that this doesn't follow from a kind of central authority imposing that. It follows from people developing conventions and working together. So I totally reject the idea that authoritarianism is required for social cohesion. As for less depression due to less thinking, what? What reason is there to think that less thinking will lead to less depression? That's crazy, right? Give people control over their own lives. Give them the ability to flourish, to be critical, to be strong, right? Make strong people. That's what leads to less depression, surely. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, right? So maybe I shouldn't make such strong claims. But surely, strong, flourishing individuals, right? That's what's going to reduce rates of depression. Not weak little rats submitting to authority. Ugh. Right? Who are these people in your surroundings? You get better associates. H. What is your position on the Pyrrhonian sceptical worry that some disagreements in philosophy might, in principle, be irresolvable? Are there any questions in particular that you think are irresolvable? What exactly did it take for disagreement to be resolvable? I mean, I can think of... So there's a few interpretations of this, right? To say that a disagreement is resolvable, that might mean, okay, we can come to know the right answer about that debate. Well, in that case, many disagreements are resolvable because we do have the right answers to them, or at least I have the right answers to them. It's not my fault that other philosophers refuse to accept the facts. For example, the moral realism, anti-realism debate is clearly resolvable in this sense. Anti-realism is clearly the correct position. Other philosophers don't accept it, but that's like, hey, what can I do? What can I do about that? I mean, I look, the only way to force somebody to accept the facts is, to point a gun at them. Like at the end of the day, if you want to reject the obvious facts, I can't stop you. So there are disagreements that are resolvable in the sense that we can get to the right answer. But just because we've got the right answer doesn't mean that other people will accept it. So the alternative way of thinking about this is in terms of convergence, right? Well, so disagreements in philosophy are resolvable if we will if philosophers in general will come to converge on what the right answer is. Now, obviously there's very little convergence in philosophy, but that's probably to its benefit, I think. I like the diversity. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. And the best way to defend your own position is to put it up against radically alternative different positions, and let them. The best way to defend your own position is to respond to the best arguments from other people. So the diversity in philosophy is a good thing. When you do get convergence on particular answers, I think that's usually just as much a result of bandwagoning as it is a result of compelling argument. So in the sense of convergence, in the sense of, right, will philosophy exhibit convergence in the future? No, probably not in the long term. So yeah, there are many disagreements in philosophy that are going to be irresolvable in that sense, but I don't see that as a problem.